Good morning and happy Tuesday 10 at 10. I am your host, Richard Charpentier, and every Tuesday we answer questions sent from bakers, answered by a baker. I'm a certified master baker and bakery scientist and been doing that for a long time, and I enjoy every Tuesday to answer your question. So let's get started. First question, someone is asking, corner of pizza not golden after baking, what's the reason? So it's a good question, but without having all of the details to know what's going on, is the rest browning? Because if you're browning everywhere else but not in the corner, and I'm picturing, based on your question, I'm picturing a square, so that means that the square, either the metal is different, or there is no conductivity of heat going through that. If it's just on the corner, it has to be a pan issue and not a formulation issue, especially if it browns everywhere else but not in the corner. Remember, it could also be the fact that the dough has issues if it's not browning well. So it could be over fermented, it could be too, the enzymatic browning is not working, or the Maillard browning. What's in your formulation that creates those issues, and what are you putting in your pan so that the corners are not browning? So I would have loved to help you a little more, but there's not enough information for me to really go into details based on just, corners. So again, assuming a corner, rectangle, or a square pan that you put your pizza in, and not, because if they're homemade pans and if the metal is too thick, or the way it's welded together, it creates maybe no conductivity for heat. But that's, again, I will have to visually look at it and to give you a more detailed answer. Next question. Somebody wants to know, if does tapioca starch make cakes more dense? So very good question. Each starches swells differently, and if it's denser, remember, the starch does not create the aeration, nor does it create the density. The starch is basically, each starch basically will swell to its capacity, and each starch has a capacity to swell more and more resistant to swelling than others. Potato starch, rice starch, wheat starch, tapioca starch has a tendency, to swell and hold on, water for your product. And what's in your product that would make it dense? Not the starch. Are you using leavening? Are you using eggs? Are you using emulsifiers? How do you process it? What's your mixing method once you do your cakes? Because all of those factors will contribute to either a light cake or a dense cake by design. So the tapioca starch, if you switched let's say if you were using a wheat starch to tapioca starch, yes, it's going to change your texture, but it also in relationship to what's your formula, how much sugar, and etc. And those will contribute to, creating different style of cakes. So if you need more help, please go through the bakery resources and look for a consultant and get someone for an hour, and to go through your recipe and understand. But each starch that you get also is not created equal in terms of the process, and tapioca starch in particular has variation based on, the starch damage, based on who's milling it, etc. So there's a lot of questions. It's not specifically just that. So, and in baking, my personal rule is, it's never one thing, and you have to start looking and map it out everywhere and understand, okay, what could be going wrong. elsewhere. So, but a good question. And now we have one more question today. And the last question is, what would the ratio of MCP to sodium bicarbonate if I wanted to make a double acting baking powder without any starch in it? So, and would it be better to use an additional slow acting acid as well? If so, what would that recipe look like? So for those who do not know, we're talking about leavening acids, and MCP, as it stands in the question, is monocalcium phosphate. And monocalcium phosphate is a leavening acid, fast reacting. And the question is, can I use that for double acting? Double acting baking powder means two leavening acid. Right now we're talking about one. So that would be single if you're using monocalcium phosphate. And personally, I would not use monocalcium phosphate as my sole leavening acid, because monocalcium phosphate releases about 60 to 70, maybe 80%, based on the conditions, of course, of its CO2 early on. So, and then therefore not much later on in the oven. And if you want to calculate how much to add in terms of a ratio, you have to look at the neutralizing value of the acid. And in the case of monocalcium phosphate, it's an 80. So that means for every 1 pound of sodium bicarbonate of baking soda you're putting it, you will have to put 1.25. So it's basically, there's equations online. I'm not going to talk about the equation. That might confuse people, but it's easy. Each of them has a neutralizing value. Each acid performs differently. But again, understand how you're building it and what functionality, because on the curve on how they release, there is a rate of reaction that can be calculated as well. And then I know we're getting complicated, but leavening acids are great for making cakes. Remember, when we're talking about bread, we're talking about a biological way of leavening the cake, leavening the breads. Now we're looking at a chemical to basically leaven the bread. There's the history behind it. It's fun, but there's a lot of things you can do with leavening acids. And if you know how to use it, and it can help you, again, create things. It's not biological. You're not really, you're basically creating CO2, same as you do in bread to push, plus more with the yeast. But those were all great questions. So I wish you a happy Tuesday, happy baking, and thank you very much for listening. And I'll see you next week. Take care, guys.